This is our grass-fed cattle production discussion for the livestock class. One thing I'd like to point out is that when you're raising grazing animals that produce methane, it needs to be done efficiently or effectively. The types of operations where beef animals are raised include cow-calf, and this is a mother cow herd or a brood herd, and it's generally done extensively using lots of pasture or rangeland, and these animals are raised by small farmers all across the country. The average size of a cow-calf herd in the U.S. is just about 10 cows, so they're not very large operations, and they're all over. Stockers are going to be the young animals that are weaned, and they're being a few hundred pounds are put on before they go to finishing or backgrounding, before they go to the final stage, which is finishing in the Midwest or Southern Plain feedlots, and this is centralized. Another type of beef animal that is raised includes dairy beef, the males that are not needed for milking, and veal calves also, and raising replacement heifers, which are cows that are going to be joining the dairy herd. And there's also purebred operations. This image shows the Dexter herd that we used to have at the SD farm. This is Todd getting familiar with these 3-year-old calves that they were born on the farm about 5 years ago, and then they came back to our farm several years ago and had their babies there, and then we raised these calves up for grass-fed production, and we dissolved the herd about a year ago. The types of cattle breeds include Bos Taurus, and this might be what you're mainly familiar with. These beef breeds include English breeds such as the Angus and the Hereford. These are small frame, fast maturing breeds that are really good for grass finishing. Bos Taurus also includes continental breeds, which are larger breeds, usually from France or Germany, like the Gelbie, which is a large frame, slow maturing animal, which is generally raised in the feedlots. And there are also heritage type breeds. Most of them are endangered, and that includes the Dexter, like we used to raise at the farm. Bos Indicus is more of a tropical type cattle, and it includes Brahma from India and also the Zebu, and they are often known for having a hump on their back for handling periods of drought. And these animals do tend to be more temperamental. Dairy breeds include Holstein, Ayrshire, and Jersey, and they do look different from the beef breeds because they're much more bony. They're putting most of their energy towards milk production, and so they do have a large udder. And we did see both Holstein genetics and also Jersey genetics at the at the Cheek farm. For cattle production and housing, beef cattle, they do need shelter breaks. They're tough animals, but they need some way to get out of the wind, and that might be a wooded area, it might be a ravine, and this is how most herds are protected. But on open range where there's no trees and nothing to stop the wind, a 3-sided shelter is really needed to help protect the animals. Bovine species are tough, and our native bison do live in blizzard conditions, but a 3-sided shelter will help a lot. Extensive pasture or rangeland is needed for grass-fed production, but what's exciting about that is we have lots of pasture and rangeland all across the country, and that does give us an opportunity for multi-species production and even stacking different types of species onto the same pasture, including not just sheep and goats, but also pastured pork and pastured poultry. In beef cattle production, it's important to understand feeding and the gastrointestinal tract because it has a large bearing on sustainability. Cattle are ruminant herbivores. They have a complex stomach that allows the animal to digest cellulose for energy, and it is the microbes in the rumen that ferment the feed. The food is actually retained, it's a complex feed, and it's actually retained in the rumen for some time, so it can be broken down. And in fact, it's regurgitated. And that's what chewing the cud is. The animals consume forage and they swallow it, and it's partially broken down in the rumen before it passes on to the rest of the GI tract. But it's regurgitated, chewed some more, swallowed again, and this helps it be adequately broken down. So you can see the animal swallows the feed through the esophagus, and it goes into a multi-compartment stomach that first includes the rumen, which is basically a 50-gallon fermentation vat inside the animal. And after it's adequately digested and the microbes have had a chance to work on it, a lot of the energy, the volatile fatty acids, actually are absorbed into the rumen wall and into the bloodstream for energy. And the feed passes on through the reticulum, through the omasum, and then to the abomasum, which is considered the true stomach. And then it passes through the digestive system, much like non-ruminant animals like us, into the small intestine and the large intestine. And it's important to take a look at the anatomy here, that the urethra and the bladder actually feed into the vaginal canal. So the orifices here that you see on a cow only include the anus and the vulva. Let's take a closer look at the anatomy again of the ruminant stomach. So here's the rumen, and then after it's digested, the feed passes into the reticulum. And this does function also as the hardware stomach, because cattle will graze just about anything on pasture, and they might even pick up screws or nails or other types of hardware. So this is where it's retained in the reticulum. The omasum actually functions as a type of filter, and then the feed passes on to the abomasum, which is the true stomach. And again, the rumen is very large. It's on the left side of the animal, and you won't forget, if you've ever seen a cannulated animal, which is being used for feed trials to see how much of the feed is broken down in the rumen. These are like little portholes that you can open up and be able to look at digestibility. On the other side, the right side, is for reproduction. So if the cow's pregnant, it's usually what you see as protrusion on the right side of the cow. So this is anaerobic microbial fermentation that takes place in the rumen. And it's the carbohydrates that the animal eats, the cellulose, the forage, including starch, and that's broken down into the volatile fatty acids. And these are actually what feed the ruminant, and they pass across the rumen wall into the bloodstream. The microbes also do provide protein to the animal, because some of them do move into, they do pass into the small intestine and are broken down along with B vitamins. Eructation, or belching, is a natural part of fermentation. And this is gas that's produced by bacteria and other microbes during the breakdown of cellulose. and this is methane, and that's how it's removed from the rumen. In fact, if an animal can't belch, or if it sometimes they get bloat and not enough gas is released, they can actually die because it exerts pressure on their diaphragm and they can't breathe. So it may seem wasteful that a lot of energy is actually removed this way, a lot of carbon, it's belched out. But keep in mind that cattle and grazing animals, they use a feed that humans cannot use, grass, and it is a form of renewable energy. I do want to point out a few things about the GI tract and the non-ruminant herbivore, like the horse, that fermentation also takes place, but it's not in the foregut. It takes place in the hindgut, in the colon or in part of the cecum also. So not as much methane is produced by horses, but they do actually have to consume a higher quality feed. They can't eat as many weeds, for example, as cattle can. It's important to understand the cattle reproductive cycle, and this is an example of spring calving. This is what we used to do at the SD farm with our mother cow herd. We tried to calve in May when there's a flush of spring forage and lots for the mother to eat while she's lactating, and then rebreed the mother by August and wean the calves by December, making sure that the cow is in a good condition as she goes into winter. And during this period she would be dry, but she is of course developing a new fetus inside, and then have her calve again by May. So this is a cycle that does demand a lot of the mother, that she lactate and grow a fetus at the same time, and we of course are asking her to do it on grass. So with reproduction, you start breeding the heifers about 15 months of age, because you don't want them also trying to grow. You want them to be mature at 2 years of age before they actually calve. So natural breeding, estrus, will take place every 21 days. And if you're doing artificial insemination, you need to be able to detect when the animal is in heat. And that's what the Estrotec sticker on the rump of the animal is for. I think Elaine told us about using these stickers at her place. They turn orange if the animal's being mounted by another animal, and that way you know that she's in heat. So if you're doing artificial insemination, that's when it's time to artificially inseminate. You should choose bulls that have the desired expected progeny differences, the EPDs that you want. For example, the size of the animal, or for good marbling. And you can certainly choose what type of bull you want if you're doing artificial insemination. If you're using natural breeding, then you do need to make sure your bulls are sound. Gestation is going to be 9 months. It's important to test for pregnancy, because if the cow's not pregnant, then she needs to be rebred as quickly as possible. So you do test at about 30 days after breeding, and this is a blood test that you draw blood from the tail vein. And we used to do this at the farm. You send in the blood test to the lab, and you can find out quickly if the animal's pregnant or not. And it's also important to check for pregnancy during the gestation period, and the way you do this is a rectal palpation, inserting your arm into the rectum, but you can feel the shape and size of the fetus through the membrane, the rectal lining. When calving takes place, generally 90% is unassisted. The cow doesn't need any help at all. But about 3 to 7% of calving, there are going to be some problems. And problems are more common with first-time mothers with heifers. So usually about 3 to 7% of calving is is fairly easy to handle and easy pull, but 3% is going to be much harder or actually involve a C-section. Normally when the calf comes out, it does come out like Superman with its forelegs in front. This is a normal presentation and drops on the ground. But sometimes if a pull is needed, these are obstetric chains, and we showed in class how to use these, that sometimes the calf does need to be pulled out or it's an even harder delivery. And hopefully this doesn't happen very frequently. I think the Cheeks mentioned that they monitor their cows very closely, and sometimes they do have to help pull them. When we had the mother cow herd at the farm, we trained the student residents in how to watch for calving. One of the most important things is just to know, when do you need to call the vet to come help? So the pre-stage, this is usually called springing, and you can see that the vulva looks loose, the udder starts to fill with milk, and this takes place over several day period before the cow actually goes into labor. Labor includes stage 1, which is usually about 1 to 4 hours, and during this time the cow is restless. She'll often separate from the rest of the herd and kind of paw towards her stomach, basically with her hind legs. If this period lasts more than 4 hours without the water bag breaking or showing, then assistance is needed. In stage 2, once the water bag shows and once it breaks, if it's out for longer than an hour and the cow is not straining and pushing, then she needs assistance. Or if she pushes for more than 30 minutes and she can't make progress getting the calf out, then assistance is needed. The afterbirth should be expelled within 12 hours. Once the calf is born, it's important to make sure that it's had colostrum within a few hours, that it's been nursing, and that's how it gets its colostrum. And the navel cord needs to be sprayed with iodine to ensure there's no infection. And generally you want to ID the calf as quickly as possible, because there's other calves being born at the same time that look exactly the same. In the case of males, if you're planning to raise them as steers, they need to be castrated as soon as possible, a band or a cut. The animal is going to grow, and it won't be weaned until about 6 to 8 months in beef animals. So generally you'll see quite a large calf trying to nurse. And for weaning, a 2-stage weaning process will reduce stress on the mother and the calf. And so that generally means weaning them and having a fence between the mother and the calf where they can still see each other and actually sniff and lick each other, or that they can't see each other or hear each other at all. Another option is to use a nose flap, and this is a little plastic flap. We've used these at the farm, that the calf can still be with the mother but can't actually nurse anymore. The flap prevents it. In terms of managing health, it's important to reduce the introduction of disease with good biosecurity and a good vaccination program. And when we had our herd, we did have a vaccination program prescribed by a local vet. So this will help prevent the herd from getting ill, and then making sure you have good fly control and parasite control. I'd actually like to use an oiled rub in the future with a natural ingredient such as cedar oil. Currently we do use the insecticidal ear tag, but we also use an oil rub that is more in the form of shorter strips that are hung from the mineral feeder. It's important to be able to judge how your animals are growing and what condition they're in. So beef cows are commonly evaluated by body condition score. So it's a 9-point scale with 5 to 7 being ideal, and 0 to 4 means they're thin, and 8 to 9 means they're over-conditioned. The places that you'll be looking include the back, the fat on the tail head, hooks and pins, which are the top of the femur. This is the pin, and this is the hook. And you'll also be looking at how many of their ribs show, and you'll be looking at the brisket. When you evaluate body condition score, you'll be evaluating a number of factors. Again, 5, 6, and 7 is the ideal body condition score. If you can see that the backbone is visible, then that's most likely a rather thin, a body condition score of 4. And if you can see 3 to 5 ribs, then that means that it's body condition score 4. If you can only see 1 to 2 ribs, the animal has more meat on it, more muscle, so it's a body condition 5. If you can't see any ribs at all, then body condition score 6. In 7, you can still slightly see the hooks and pins, the top of the femur, and the brisket looks full. The brisket is at the front, at the throat. And if you can actually see fat on the tail head, then that means the animal's probably over-conditioned, body condition score 8. It's important to know the age of your animal, and generally you will know your animal's age, but if you have bought animals and they weren't born at your farm, then you do need to determine to be sure of what the age is. Most animals that are going to slaughter are going to be less than 2 years old, and if they're less than 2, they probably just have mainly their baby milk teeth. Once they reach 2 or 2.5, they're going to have 2 of their adult teeth, and then once they reach 3 years, they'll have 4 of their adult teeth, and then by 4 years, they'll have a full mouth, 8 tooth of adult teeth. If they're over 4 years old, then you do tend to see a little more breakage or wear in the teeth. It's important to know the age, and we'll look at that as we start to evaluate the quality of the meat. To finish an animal means to add a fat finish, or marbling. The animal has grown its frame and muscle throughout its life, and finishing does mean adding fat. Marbling is intramuscular fat, and you do tend to see this quite quickly in grain-fed animals. They can finish more quickly in 1.5 years, and it takes grass-fed animals up to 2 years to finish. And you do need to use a rapidly maturing breed like the Angus or like the Hereford. And you actually need to have an average daily gain of at least 1.5 pounds or 2 pounds a day to be able to ensure that you can finish on grass. And grass does have less marbling. More of the fat is actually extramuscular near the skin, but it contains more omega-3 fatty acids, so it is a healthier fat than grain-fed, and it does tend to be more yellow because it has more carotenoids and actually more vitamins. When the animal's finished, it's time for processing or slaughter. And you need to use a government-inspected slaughter plant if you sell the meat. If you just intend to eat the meat yourself, then you can kill the animal at your own farm. At the plant, the Humane Slaughter Act requires that the animal be insensible at the time of kill. So that means stunning, for example, with a captive bolt, before the animal is hoisted and its throat is cut. The carcass does need to age before it can be frozen or cut up, and a dry age is better, allowing up to 2 weeks for enzymes to actually break down and tenderize the meat. The quality grades of beef do depend on how the animal's raised and also on its maturity level. And I did mention that animals need to be young to achieve a high quality grade. So on this axis you see the age of the animal. These are the highest grades of beef, and it's related on this axis to their degree of marbling or intramuscular fat. So prime rib, prime is the highest grade, and choice is the next highest. So you can see that prime and choice do have quite a bit of marbling or fat in the muscle. Some of these other grades, select, standard, don't have as much marbling. And then commercial, utility, these apply to older animals, and these are animals that are, about 3 or 4 years old. So these won't be high quality beef cuts. You can see better from these images of what the intramuscular fat or marbling looks like. So this is the moderately abundant. You can see the flecks of fat within the meat. This is slightly abundant, and by the time you get to slight, you don't see very much marbling or fat within the meat at all. Most of the fat is actually extramuscular. There are certification programs that producers use to assure their customers that the beef has been raised on pasture and pasture finished. We'll look at the NC State local pasture raised and finished program. And this ensures that mainly forage feeding is used to grow the animals. Some amount of supplementation is permitted, but only when the animal's young, from weaning to yearling, only at 0.5% of their body weight. So it can't be higher than that. And I think we looked at, that might be about 2, 3, 4 pounds of corn is what that might be. I think a 1,000-pound animal, if it needs 4% of its body weight, which growing animals need, that might be about 40 pounds if it's going to be a 1,000-pound cow. So we're not talking about a lot. This is just a little bit of supplementation. And then as the animal's older, from yearling to finish, up to 1%. And the supplementation actually should be low starch supplements, much like the forage is low in starch. So it really doesn't mean corn. It usually means more of corn gluten feed, soybean hulls, or wheat bran, which I think y'all know are high in fiber. And no hormone implants or antibiotic growth promoters are permitted, and the animals must be raised only on pasture, and confinement in feedlots is not permitted. This is the end of our discussion.